So the plan for this one is I'm going to ask the first question and hope these three talk for 39 minutes. So we'll see how that goes. So before we get into it, should we go down the line and just brief introductions for people? Have you got a...
Yes, I'll start. Kirsten Bartok-Tao, nice to see everyone. Happy to be back. I work with two organizations right now. One, Air Finance and AF Capital, which has been a longtime partner of XM and other export credit agencies. We finance anything but Boeings, we like to say, in XM, correct? So, and have been doing that in partnership with the U.S. Export-Import Bank for the last 12 years, UKEF, serve a bunch of other export credit agencies. And then I have another hat, which is also New Vista Capital, which is venture capital and a strategic advisory firm focused on emerging aerospace, space, and defense. I'll hand it off.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Fiore. I'm the Vice President of the Transportation Division at the Export-Import Bank. Ex-Im Bank is the official export credit agency of the United States. Our mission is to support exports of U.S. manufactured equipment and services. My division leads our efforts in financing transportation equipment, which means aircraft, obviously, all kinds of aircraft, large commercial aircraft, business aircraft, helicopters, and now eventually advanced air mobility aircraft. And then also we support rail exports as well. And also, I forgot to mention agricultural aircraft. And I also am leading the effort with our domestic finance program, which is also relevant to advanced air mobility, because for the first time, Ex-Im Bank, instead of just being able to finance the foreign buyer of a U.S. manufactured product, we can now provide financing for increasing the export capacity of domestic companies, and I'll talk about that during our presentation today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Wolfe. I am counsel at Warshaw Burstein, a mid-market Tier 1 law firm in New York City, where I am practice chair of the Emerging Technologies Law Group. I also am on the board of directors for the National Space Society, as well as the United Nations Association, and I work with a portfolio of emerging technology companies across an array of corporate transactional matters, including working with venture capitalists, VC firms, private equity, debt financing, investment strategies, raising companies from seed to exchange listings. Thank you.
So my first and hopefully only question is, we've spoken a lot over the last few days about the requirement, how capital intensive advanced air mobility and developing new aviation companies are and technologies. So what role and how do you see the collaboration between public financing and private financing in helping these companies develop and the whole overall industry grow? Does anyone want to start on that one?
Oh, sure, I'll begin. Well, private financing necessarily needs to work in tandem with public funding to achieve the capitalization necessary in these types of emerging industries where you're doing hard tech, right? There's a significant difference in the capital necessary and the obstacles to revenue production for these types of companies, which make private and public financing critical for industries like AAM. One model, of course, is the public-private partnership, PPPs, and to that extent, we can leverage many lessons, including those, for example, through NASA and NASA's Commercial Crew Program and their milestone projects. And then similarly, renewable energies. You can draw upon the various different approaches there that have been used to meld private and public financing to address the high capitalization barriers for this type of industry.
How about if I go? I concur with all of that. I like to think about it as in the TRL spectrum. So if you think of TRL 1 through 9, there's appropriate capital for the earliest stages, where it's true idea formation, development, the early testing of the IP, what works. So let's say TRL, that is venture capital, that's government R&D, that is. But then when you get further along on the TRL and you're up to 6 or 7, that's where you're really iterating and testing your aircraft and testing its capabilities. And you have a line of sight to approval of an entry into service. And that is a very costly period because you're building multiple aircraft and you get it. But it also is a good place for the government to be able to step in and provide some of that infrastructure funding, especially if we want to locate manufacturing here in the United States. And there is a choice that a startup company, AAM, has to make. Do they outsource their production to the airframe and become an assembler, as we see many of the larger commercial aircraft companies have done? Not all, but there has been that trend over the years. Or do you insource more of it and take that more in-house and have more control over your timeline, your supply chain? And the government does have a role if we want to, one, keep these technologies here domestically, and two, support more manufacturing. And I think that's where we can spend time talking today about some of those tools and levers that provide longer-term financing to help you get through what we often call the valley of death, which is kind of that growth stage when you're in TRL 6 through TRL 9, getting ready for that commercial entry into service.
And if I could just add to that, with Ex-Im Bank's domestic finance program, that's exactly the niche that we're trying to fill. A company where Ex-Im Bank is, we're a federal agency, right? So we're working with taxpayer money, so we have to be very prudent with that taxpayer funding. But we are trying to, and we're not financing venture capital, we're not financing R&D or the development of intellectual property. Our idea is to help these companies that are on the cusp of having commercialization of a product, aircraft or other industries. Our domestic finance program is eligible to any kind of industry, old, new, or whatever. And the idea is to keep the production in the United States, to make loans and support the scaling up of the production, and make loans that a commercial bank might find too risky. And then ultimately, once that company is able to manufacture at scale, ideally, and when they start exporting, we'd like to support their foreign buyers and provide financing for them as well. And then once they don't need our financing anymore, we gracefully bow out and let the private sector take over, and we continue moving on to the next company. So that's the sweet spot that our domestic finance program is trying to fill.
And I'd like just to emphasize that in context here, with respect to the AAM industry, the funding levels are critical, and there's numerous companies that are approaching their critical cash flow limits. We've had, in the last year, 400 supply chain partnerships. There's 8,000 testing hours that were accomplished in 2023, no less, and ongoing year after year growth, but still that critical cash flow issue remains, especially in the lower TRLs that are trying to get through their pre-seed Series A's and Series B's and approaching exchange listings. And that really creates investor uncertainty, which is hindering new rounds of financing for many of the companies in the AAM industry. And also we've seen, obviously, there's been talk here at the conference related to bankruptcy concerns for several of these companies. And I think here that this panel is especially valuable because a discussion around public financing to stabilize the AAM startup and ecosystem is critical because we are pivoting into a new administration, and the next 4 years for AAM is going to be important, drawing upon some personal experience in the commercial space industry where I see AAM is, maybe 10 years behind, 10, 15 years behind. We had a period of consolidation, of acquisition and consolidations, which quickly gave rise to some major market players, and that was intertwined with the SPAC activity. However, we haven't been seeing something similar in terms of the roll-ups or the roll-up strategies in this industry, and that is similarly impacting the critical cash flow limits and runway, pun intended, because of the capitalization needs for these companies as they move from design, testing, prototype to flight operations. Now, the investor uncertainty, while it's unquantifiable, there's certainly overriding issues that are prevalent, including regulatory frameworks and the FAA's roadmap for their 2028 roadmaps, which inherently create longer ROIs, and that chills investor interest into an industry, which makes public financing and PPP partnerships all the more important for the AAM.
Can I make one final?
Absolutely.
I started here, I think, at your first Revolution.Aero, and I did one topic on like, where's the money going to come from? Because it wasn't apparent to me where the money was going to come from for these long, capital-intensive time horizon. And then we hit the positive fundraising years, or say of 2019, 2020, and then of course we hit the wall in 2021. And we're back again in this market of it's very, very difficult when you have both technology risk as an investor early stage, and then you also have the risk of, is this company going to raise capital? So, for example, if you invest in a software company and it's got success, it just doesn't require that much cash, and it's a lot easier for a venture capitalist to put money into it. But if you're in a deep tech, highly regulated, long time horizon, you've got the technological risk of, is this possible for what you're saying is done? And then the second part of, will you find the financing there? Which actually is almost more risky today than actually you all being able to develop the technology. And I think that is a difficult thing. And the government has kind of recognized this in a post-2021 world, and they've also recognized where we stand relative to our competitors. And that is why they've put in place these additional programs that David's been talking about, counter China, because they've seen this risk and they want to make sure that we encourage technologies to stay here, and that as you get rid of that technology risk in the early stages, they will come in and help you support the big capital on the back end of it.
So David, what are the solutions that you guys have at Exim that are sort of applicable and that people should know about for this space that you can utilize to help AM companies?
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, there are three ways I think that Exim Bank can help advanced air mobility companies. The first is with the domestic finance program, as I mentioned. We can support financing of or refinancing of capital equipment, a building, any kind of tangible asset that a lender would like to finance that we could take security in. And with regard to private partnerships, public partnerships, that's part of what we do in our credit underwriting. We look to see who is invested in the company, how deep are the pockets, how committed are the investors. That gives us comfort before the transaction team makes a recommendation to our board that we approve a deal. We look at all the things that a lender would look at to make sure that the transaction could the loan could be repaid. We have a statutory requirement called reasonable assurance of repayment, which is congressional, it's in our charter, and it basically means that we have to be able to say with a straight face to our board of directors, yeah, we're going to get repaid. And if we don't, if something goes wrong, we have collateral, we can restructure. We're patient capital, we can take a long-term view, especially in these advanced technologies, not only in aerospace, but in batteries and other technologies as well. So the first pillar is the domestic finance program, medium and long-term capital to increase export capacity, which came out of an executive order in early 2021 that led to, in which Exim Bank was asked by the current administration to develop basically turn its programs inward and figure out a way to support domestic companies. That's number one. Then our second, once you get to the stage where you're producing aircraft or an item, we have a working capital guarantee program for small businesses and medium-sized businesses where we can lend against export-related inventory and export-related receivables so that you can ramp up production, and you have to have a foreign order. And we can guarantee a loan made by a commercial lender to support the ramp up and the production of the aircraft or whatever it is you're manufacturing, the battery or the whatever. And so that's our working capital guarantee program, and that's that's handled by a different department within Exim Bank. But we're hoping that all these we know that all these divisions within the bank will coordinate and share information, and we will basically be able to provide a soup to nuts solution for companies. And then last but not least is our traditional export finance programs, which is what we've been doing for the last 90 years since 1934 when we were created during the Great Depression to support exports of U.S. equipment. There, let's say you're an airline buying a fleet, or a training company buying a fleet of advanced air mobility aircraft, and you need financing to be able to afford them, we can provide financing under our traditional export finance programs the same way we finance a Cessna or a Boeing or a Gulfstream or a Leonardo helicopter. So those are the three ways that we can support this industry. So far we've done the first one, and we're looking forward to doing the working capital. We've done domestic finance. We're looking forward to doing more domestic finance, ultimately moving into working capital, and then ultimately export financing. And regarding export financing, one thing I forgot to mention was, right now we have something called a letter of interest. If you are in a sales campaign and you're looking to sell your aircraft to a foreign buyer, we can provide you with a letter of support that you can then present with your bid or with your proposal to that company, in which Ex-Im Bank will say, we understand you're considering buying technology from X company. We have a lot of experience financing aircraft. To the extent you decide to purchase this aircraft, we can help you. We can consider sitting down with you and consider putting together a financing package that you will find attractive, and so please buy American equipment. I mean, that's basically a letter that we can do. We can tailor it to meet your needs, to the specific sales campaign or the sales proposal that you're trying to match. So that we can do now, even before the aircraft is certified and all that. So there are multiple ways we're trying to help ensure that the U.S. maintains its leadership in aerospace.
David, can I do some leading here?
Can you do some what?
Some leading.
Sure.
So you're really good at supporting aircraft sales once they're finally made. So you sell them to India, you sell them into Mexico. You're awesome at that. You become awesome, you're getting awesome at what you did for Beta. You finance their factory, which they're going to build their aircraft in, right? And that's kind of what you call under this Make More in America program, the MMIA. You mentioned working capital. Describe to us what working capital would be. Would that be buying, if you think of how Tesla's made, buying the machinery to build the aircraft, or what do you think of working capital in this room? What would that be in AAM?
No, buying the equipment to manufacture the aircraft would fall under the domestic finance program. That's medium, long-term capital to support increased production capacity, export capacity for a company. Working capital, the way we use it at Ex-Im Bank, and I think this is generally the way everybody uses it, would be the inventory, the work in process inventory, the raw materials, the payment for labor, things that you need.
So like receivables financing.
Yeah, manufacturing, what you need to purchase to manufacture the aircraft, pay your suppliers, that kind of thing, and then ultimately, once you complete manufacturing of the aircraft, then you sell it. If either you're paid in full, or if there's a receivable, like a 30, 60, 90-day receivable, that can be part of what we can finance as well. The working capital program works off a borrowing-based formula where the guaranteed lender tracks how much collateral is eligible, and then there's an advance rate against the different categories of eligible collateral, and then the outstanding balance under the loan has to be within that, be supported by the eligible collateral. Now, as let's say your receivable is paid by the foreign buyer, well, then that loan you pay down that amount of on the line of credit, but then you can borrow again to make the next aircraft. So it's a revolving line of credit to assist in the actual manufacturing of export-related equipment. It has to be export-related. That's a key thing. This is part of why we're the Export-Import Bank. It has to be export-related. But that's how we would.
But David's pretty creative in that. You can have those MOIs out there to do so.
Right, but and then the Export Finance Program would not be any of that. That would be for the financing for, some training school in India or, Emirates or whoever you're selling to.
I wanted to ask you guys about regulatory delays and the risk that has in terms of potentially putting off private investors, and how David, you mentioned you guys are patient in your investments, and in terms of how the delays in getting to certification and then production that we've seen over the last few years, and how that tolerance potentially with public finance can come and help people developing aircraft when a private investor would say, okay, you said you're going to certify in 2023, now it's 2025, like, and it was mentioned in the VC one, they'd rather it be honest at the point when you're going to certify rather than say we're going to do it quicker and then have to delay and delay.
Well, I think the tough part with that is just that funds have 10-year lives. I mean, and there's more and more pressure these days for them to live within those 10-year lives, or they have to sell to a secondary buyer. And that's where there's not a good, timing match between how long the aircraft cycles take to develop a program, certification, and start getting revenues. So hence, there's an opportunity. You'll do 15-year financing for a building, won't you? Sometimes?
Under the domestic finance program, we can set whatever repayment term we think is appropriate for the asset and for the credit risk. One of the great things about the domestic finance program is we are not bound by the OECD rules. For export credit financing, again, not to get too far into the weeds, but for export credit financing, our counterparts in Europe and Japan and Korea and elsewhere, we all agree to play by certain rules in terms of maximum repayment term, maximum advance rate on a good, things like that. But that's only for export financing. For domestic finance, all bets are off. We can do whatever we want as long as we don't undermine our commitments under the WTO. So it can't be seen as a subsidy. And so to do that, we just charge market rates on the fees that come along with our financing. But so that's how we handle that aspect.
Can I bring up SBIR financing here?
Absolutely.
So I think, and again, for those of you that are U.S. companies here, other countries have, we have a SBIR financing, SBIR, SBITR, and they're historically under the SBA, but there's $2 billion a year that the Department of Defense gives out for R&D grants associated with things that they're interested in. Vertical propulsion is one of them, and it has been actively used by Joby and all of your other players out there who are further along. Electra has been a huge user of it. And interesting enough, so the SBIRs go in phase 1, 2, and 3, and again, they're more for the early stage awards. They also help develop relationships within our Department of Defense. But one of the key things that our Department of Defense has done is that they've recognized that building up this ecosystem, the batteries, the propellers, the motors, will have long-term implications for a broad type of technologies, which is why they've shown an extra interest in the commercial side of this space. So there is that early stage R&D funding, which can be pretty significant. And then there's also matching funds that are under the Air Force's SBIR programs called the STRATFI and TACFI awards. And it can be up to $30 million in matching funds. So if you raise $30 million from a VC investor, they will match $30 million of that. So it's non-dilutive capital. So we're seeing more and more of these programs put in place to encourage investment in your area because there is that recognition it's tough to raise in deep tech, long time horizon companies.
James, I want to come to you and talk. Can you talk to other industries? Because we've mentioned defense and what they're doing there. Can you talk to sort of, in the renewable space, there's a lot of work with the Inflation Reduction Act on tax incentives and other sort of public solutions to encourage financing in big infrastructure projects. So can you talk to any similarities between this and that?
Sure, certainly. I would like to bring up one point that if the AAM industry has not already adopted a strong SBIR-SITR proposal program internally, then that's something that you would really want to consider as you're progressing through your series rounds. So I certainly concur with you. Many of the companies in my own portfolio that bridge the divide between hypersonics and eVTOLs and likewise in the commercial space sector, they heavily rely on SBIRs and SITRs. In fact, that demonstrates to investors as well that there's competence in the company and that you're not necessarily only relying on dilutive private equity capital. So there's a lot of importance there. And with respect to NASA alone, NASA puts in funding specifically for AAM under their Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate program. The AAM National Campaign, for example, they work with the companies providing test flights and integration of AAM into national airspace. Joby and WISC also, have received grants like that. NASA also has an urban air mobility ground challenge program that provides technical expertise and test facilities. So it covers some of those hardware infrastructure asset capital outlays through research and development programs. And I think that it's critical and very important because, again, that demonstrates to investors who are likely chilled on the more long-term ROI constraints of the AAM industry that there's supplemental private capital or public capital to assist in the capitalization and development programs for the companies.
Could I go back to your question about regulatory risk? I just wanted to add that regulatory risk is something new for Ex-Im Bank. Typically in our export finance programs, you get an email from the FAA that the export certificate of airworthiness is there, is signed, and then we get on the closing call and we fund the aircraft, whatever that is. But so in looking at the financing for AAM companies under the domestic finance program, we had to understand that risk a little bit more because, as you say, it can take longer than anticipated. And especially with eVTOLs, the path it's not a well-trodden path yet, but hopefully it soon will be. So that was a risk that we did an analysis of and working with consultants to try to help us understand that risk better. And then from a credit perspective, what we did, that was part of sort of the credit analysis was, okay, if things are delayed, how strong how strong is the capital stack? How deep are the pockets? If they need another 6 months or a year, will the capital be available? What is the path to certification? Does it make sense, from in the eyes of a third party, an independent third party? So that's how we. We're still learning. We still have lots more to learn, but we're getting up to speed on that risk, and we're also educating our senior management and our board on that risk as well, which at this point they were prepared to take reasonable risks for the policy benefits that are waiting at the end of the rainbow.
Right, and as an emerging technologies attorney, I can certainly second that comment that I think predictable regulatory pathways are critical, not only for the individual companies operating within the AAM industry, whether they're flight operators or within the ecosystem of the vertical, but also for the industry overall, right? So from my legal perspective, right, I see several potential trends going forward. One would be unifying further the international certification frameworks with ESA, because I think that a lot of the international capital would want to see a harmonized regulatory framework that further reduces critical regulatory risk with respect to operations and therefore financing and deployment of these systems internationally. And then also regulatory considerations for the operating companies with respect to zoning laws and airspace management for urban operations. I think that that's critical, and in any emerging technology industry in a highly regulatory enforced environment, having sophisticated counsel is critical to those ends to ensure that the industry is being appropriately lobbied for and addressed at the company level. And structuring insurance and indemnity clauses, and this is in relation to the PPPs as well, that to manage these inherent regulatory risks and delays and unforeseen issues as it relates to regulations and regulatory concerns. I'm not sure how many people in the audience are familiar with Part 194, which was just recently adopted or promulgated, if you will, at the regulatory level. And that's providing an adaptive regulatory framework. And so industry consideration of those regulatory frameworks and participation in developing out those rule sets. And I think that part of the coordination is critical. You're not doing engineering or design per se, but it's similarly just as important to ensure that the company's able to address its total applicable market goals, your TAMs and such.
So we've got some questions on Slido, if we could put that up on the screen. Kirsten, I'm going to come to you with the first one that says, how do you perceive the new administration in DC will impact the public funding programs? Because in certainly in Sustainability and the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a lot of concern there that that could be watered down, potentially got rid of entirely. How do you see that being a challenge when it comes to public-related finance?
I do see some parts of the Inflation Reduction Act at risk. I think it is, it would have to be voted into, so they haven't been entirely successful at turning the, but there can be regulatory limitations putting in. I am less concerned about XM or SBIRs, or I think that, how many years ago? So 2005, right? There was the far right of the Republican Party that really wanted a complete Milton Friedman, no interference in commercial markets, and they pushed back for the first time in 100 years on the Export-Import Bank. But in 2019, with the reauthorization and the new mandate to have XM be supportive of the U.S. in the fight against China and helping keep up and with our near-peer competitors, and the world has only gotten less and less stable from a geopolitical situation, I think the government has recognized that they don't have tools. And while you will actually see, I think you'll see much more activist Trump administration, business people in seats that will not be afraid to use the capabilities of the organizations for the benefit of the United States. So I think certainly in areas like the XM Bank, where they understand how powerful of a Build America Strong tool that can be, I think we've got lots of reason for hope. I do think there's a lot of uncertainty in Washington, D.C. about how long people will have their jobs if they're in government, but which is a little precarious. But I think from this perspective, and certainly from the DoD, I spent the last few days with some government officials working on plans for how we can be more adaptive, more lean into new technologies, encourage their development here and support them. So I think I'm very optimistic in that area.
David, there's a question at the bottom regarding risk of payment, but
yes,
I think broaden it out maybe beyond China. Just how can you help with that?
Sure. With regard to the last question there, yes, if you have a foreign customer and there may be a risk of repayment, ideally not China, because we're not really supporting exports to China these days. Now, where did the question go? Oh, there it is. For an aerospace project, I'm interpreting that as a sale of an aircraft. Yes, that's exactly what Exim Bank can do. Our guarantee will guarantee, usually what we do is we guarantee a loan made by a commercial lender, so that if an airline fails to pay on the agreed terms, the lender can turn to Exim Bank and receive our payment, our full guarantee, whether that default is caused by political risk or commercial risk. And then we will then step into the shoes of the lender. We'll pay the claim, the lender goes away, and we step into the shoes of the lender, and we restructure, we take the asset back, we do whatever we need to do to make the taxpayers whole. And that's our bread and butter. And there's a pretty standard structure for asset-backed finance lease transactions with aircraft that we and also our colleagues on the European export credit agencies use the same structure as well, where there's an SPV, bankruptcy remote SPV that's owned usually by an orphan trust in Delaware that buys the aircraft from the manufacturer, leases it to the foreign airline, and then the airline makes lease payments to the SPC, who then makes loan payments to the guaranteed lender, and Exim Bank guarantees the whole thing. And in return for that, our job, the folks on my team, the loan officers who are doing the underwriting, we'll do the credit analysis of the airline, we'll structure the transaction to make sure we're properly secured, we'll get any additional credit enhancements that we think are necessary based on our assessment of the risk of the country and the buyer and the aircraft type or whatever. And that's our standard bread and butter asset-backed finance lease transaction.
Have we got any questions from the floor, old school? Anyone?
David, will you cover PDPs?
Yes, we started dipping our toe into the waters of PDP financing. Traditionally, we had not done that because the commercial markets were willing to finance PDPs, but we have found more and more that there is a growing need for PDP financing. So we are on a selective basis doing PDP financing for certain airlines, provided they need it. Again, one point that I haven't mentioned is Exim Bank has an additionality test, meaning that we will only provide financing where we are filling a financing gap or that the commercial markets will not finance, or if there's a competitiveness issue. Or let's say the European export credit agencies are financing an Airbus aircraft, well then we want to level the playing field for the US manufacturer, and then we're prepared to provide financing so that the playing field is level. And that's not just related to aircraft, that's across all our financing, whether we're financing a Caterpillar tractor or anything. So there always has to be a need for Ex-Im Bank. So we're finding that there is a growing need for PDP financing, and so we've done 2 transactions now. We obviously,
do you require a lien over the aircraft?
Well, at that point, the aircraft doesn't exist, so there's nothing to have a lien over. But if it's an airline that we know that we have already financed a lot of aircraft for, we will have a book of business, and that we could be cross-collateralized. If we've financed 10 aircraft for Airline X in Africa, we have a pretty good loan-to-value on the whole portfolio, and everything is cross-defaulted and cross-collateralized. So in some cases, if we're comfortable with it, we could just rely on that cross-default provision and cross-collateralization provisions to indirectly secure the PDP financing, especially given that it's relatively short-term, as everyone knows, whereas our aircraft financing is usually on a 10 or 12-year repayment term. There are situations where we wouldn't need any collateral at all if we're comfortable with the credit risk. So everything is done selectively on a case-by-case basis.
We've got another question referring to the double risk and asking if you could discuss the appropriate discount rate to value an investment. We're discussing it. Anyone got any thoughts on that?
So I think there's a slightly different way to think about it, which I think is why venture capital has struggled to invest in aerospace. Because, so if you're a venture capital fund, certainly in the early stage, you expect, let's say, only 2 of your 10 investments are going to make money. But you expect them to return, 100 to 500 times. Like, that's how you do well as a venture fund. The tough part with it, and I encourage aerospace entrepreneurs to understand why they're not always a great fit for Sand Hill Road venture capital investors, because it becomes difficult for you with how aerospace companies are valued and how much capital needs to go into a company, the dilution, to show those type of returns on the other end, which has partly been why there has been a gap between who is available to fund early stage aerospace companies, because you've got private equity out there that only needs to make multiple times returns, but they need no risk. They don't want technology risk, they don't want time, they need you to have EBITDA. And the venture capital guys really need you to be able to make 100 to 200 plus times on the capital returns. So it's less of a discount, it's more of an understanding the outsized returns that the venture capital model is built upon.
Great. I think we've just run out of time, so we've had our time, but these guys will be around afterwards if there are any other questions. Thank you all for your thoughts.